Okay, good evening, everybody. I'm David Gaynor. I'm the Consul General of the U.S. Consulate here in Perth. Apologize for a little bit of a late start. We are really delighted this evening to be having a web discussion with the panel, actually in person, to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the women's suffragette movement in the United States. First and foremost, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of land on which we meet, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'm going to try and be very brief because we really want to get to the thoughts and analysis of our panelists tonight, which includes first Dr. Ann Ali, federal member from Cowan. Dr. Ann Ali was inducted into the WA Women's Hall of Fame in 2011. And was the only representative from Australia to speak at President Obama's 2015 White House Summit on Countering Violent Extremism. Elizabeth Shaw, Associate Director at KPMG and former President of UN Women Australia. Elizabeth is an alumni of the State Department's International Visitor Leadership Program. And next to Elizabeth, Jessica Short, WA Team Lead for Aged Care at the United Workers Union. Co-founder of She Runs, racial inequality advocate, and also alumni of our International Visitor Program. Our panelists will speak in a few minutes about women's suffrage movement and what it means to them. Then we'll open the floor to questions. You can either type in your question via chat, and I will then, or if you want to raise your hand, I think we're raising hands, Helen, or if you want to somehow wave. But typing in your question is preferable if you have questions. And certainly please feel free to take any photos and post them onto your socials and our socials as well. But just briefly, just a few words about tonight. Tonight we celebrate 100 years of American women's right to vote. On August 18, 1920, the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified. The amendment states that the rights of citizens to vote shall not be denied on the basis of sex. It does not, however, prevent discrimination based on other categories such as race. We take the 1965 Voting Rights Act to guarantee the right to vote to all American citizens. The 19th Amendment, however, was pivotal and a significant step toward equality. I'll give a very brief overview, and we've got a short video that we'll show in a moment too. The first National Women's Rights Convention was held in October 1850, in Massachusetts. Among the speakers were women such as Harriet Hunt, who had been denied admission into Harvard Medical School. The delegates resolved to achieve political, legal, and social equality with men. That was 170 years ago. In 1869, Wyoming passed the first women's suffrage law. In 1878, a women's suffrage amendment was proposed in the U.S. Congress, but it was defeated in the Senate a year later. Almost 50 years later, the 19th Amendment passed, and it was worded exactly the same as it was originally proposed in 1878. So right now we have a brief 2-minute video to show you from the Library of Congress.
By the mid-1800s, women began to build a movement to address their social and political inequality.
They were done with the restrictions imposed on their lives.
Women were denied the votes.
Women who worked were dramatically underpaid.
Women were denied entry to college.
Women were forced to submit to laws they couldn't help create.
On account of sex.
We hold these truths to be self-evident.
That all men and women
are created equal.
Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton,
Susan B. Anthony,
Lucy Stone,
Sojourner Truth,
Mary Church Terrell,
Alice Paul,
Carrie Chapman Catt.
These women, and so many others,
knew that in their struggle for suffrage,
they would face misconception,
misrepresentation,
and ridicule. but they persisted.
Without her,
My opportunities are limited.
Without her,
My wages are not my own.
Without her, I am unrepresented.
Without them,
We are denied.
Denied the vote. Denied representation.
denied equality.
The 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution states,
The right of citizens of the United States to vote.
Shall not be denied.
Or abridged by the United States.
or by any state on account of sex.
The amendment was passed by Congress in June 1919.
It was ratified by 36 states by August 1920.
On November 2nd, 1920,
Millions of women voted for the first time.
in the presidential election.
we stand because they stood.
Their struggle is our progress.
the right to vote.
The right to vote.
The right to vote.
Shall not be denied
72 years of struggle.
for us.
Okay, thank you, Haley. Just briefly, as we've seen in this video and as discussed further tonight, this accomplishment did not occur overnight. It took decades of campaigning and resilience. A leading suffragists and campaigner for the 19th Amendment, Alice Paul, said, quote, "I always feel the movement is a sort of mosaic. Each of us puts in one little stone, and then you get a great mosaic at the end," unquote. That was the United States 100 years ago. This coming March, we look forward to the 100th anniversary of Cowan becoming the first woman elected to the Australian Parliament. So right now, I'd like to turn to our panelists to ask some questions and get their reflections as we celebrate 100 years of women voting in the United States. First, start with Dr. Ali. Can you give us your thoughts on the significance of the subject?
Thank you, David. I actually got quite emotional watching that video and just being here, David, quite emotional because I think of 100 years, which is an incredibly long time, and how far we've come in that 100 years. But I'm still every day reminded of how much further we have to go. And I think we should never lose sight of how much further we have to go. 2016, I was elected to Parliament and I was the first Muslim woman elected to Parliament. And at that time, I reflected on the fact that why do we still have firsts for women? And I think as long as we still have firsts for women, we still have a long way to go. As long as every woman who achieves something that men have already achieved, and that it's become quite commonplace for men to have achieved, and she becomes the first, while it's something that we should celebrate, we should continue also to ask ourselves, why has it taken this long for a first? You know, I watch and I read about the suffragette movement, and it was something that I engaged with in my teenage years. You know, I read Naomi Wolf when I was 14. I read Becky Friedan. I used to get the books and I used to hide them under my mattress where my mother couldn't find them. And I never ever spoke about women's rights in public. It was kind of something that I did in private. At night, I would hide in my bedroom and read these books. And I had this absolute fascination with these women who I thought were paving the way for somebody like me. But it wasn't until much later when I discovered a woman by the name of Quotas, who was actually born in the town, the Egyptian town where my mother was born. And she was a pioneer of feminism throughout the Middle East. So Quotas grew up in the harem system, which required women to fully cover their faces and be hidden away from public life. She became involved in the movement in the Middle East and died just a few years short of seeing Egyptian women get the vote in the 1950s. But she's most remembered for getting off a train at Cairo train station, and removing her face veil. Now, in my mind, the way that I imagine Huda to be she rips off that veil and she throws it to the wind and she yells, "Be gone, oh shackle of oppression." And then she's met by all these cheers in the crowd. Obviously that's not how she did it, but that's the way that Helen would have done it. She did it actually very quietly because it was met with such apprehension. But that single action sparked a wave across the Middle East of women removing their face veils and started this real movement in the Middle East. And so when I got to this point in my life where I learned about Quotas and the movement in the Middle East and how women's rights were brought and women got the vote in places like Egypt. And then I looked at kind of the suffragette movement in the US and the right to vote here in Australia and things that women in Western countries were doing. And I tried to apply that to myself, and I found myself in my early 20s in a position where I actually rejected a whole lot of it because to me, it felt like I had been left behind. And I had been left behind because the Western constructs didn't work for me and didn't engage with movements in other parts of the world. I've come full circle since then, and I now look at the suffragette movement and fully realise for myself how much that means to me and the fact that I do walk in the footsteps of these women, but that I also have footsteps, and each one of us has footsteps that we leave for those who come after us. I'm in Parliament now, and yet I still wear that label of the first Muslim woman in Parliament, as well as the first woman who was a professor, but that's never mentioned in the headlines, as well as the first counterterrorism expert, but that's never mentioned in the headlines, as well as the first graduate of Edith Cowan University, but that's never mentioned in the headlines either. But I take comfort in knowing that just like the woman who came before me, I have an opportunity here to leave a legacy, to leave footprints for the women coming after me to walk in, so that we can finally get to a point where there are no more firsts. And I think that's my starting comments here, and I'm really happy to engage with questions. Thank you.
Elizabeth.
Great, gosh, man, you're hard to follow. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here on such a wonderful occasion. It's so nice to come and talk and be part of a discussion on suffrage and participation from 100 years ago until today. So particularly with such amazing panellists. And over the last few weeks, when I've been thinking about the passing of the 19th Amendment, I sort of summed up my thoughts in three main ways. The first was gratitude, and touched on a bit of this, that kind of, all of us who sit here, we stand on the shoulders of these incredible women who us, and there's so much in our lives that we really, take advantage of because of the struggle and toil that's come for us. And as a woman and as a gender equality advocate, I'm so grateful for those passionate, persistent women who fought for so long. It's quite remarkable that that movement took 100 years to be realised. It's an incredibly long time, and I think the women who died before seeing that come to fruition would have just been very bittersweet when it came to pass. And also I think that when you watch that video, you realise the situation for women at that time who didn't enjoy so many rights and property. If they got divorced, they couldn't take custody of their kids, they couldn't control their earnings. So they have that vision and that transformative agenda, I think, was really powerful. The second aspect of this commemoration is really one of reflection. So thinking about this march towards progress in the enfranchisement of women in the US, just as African American men only got the vote about 50 years after white men voted, it took quite a while for the franchise to be able to be exercised by African American, Asian American, Hispanic, Native American until the passing of that Voting Rights Act. And similarly in Australia, while women enjoyed the vote in 1902, it wasn't until 1967 that our Indigenous people were able to vote. And so, I think the women's movement has become more inclusive and intersectional since then, but I still think there's a lot more that needs to go into making it more intersectional and recognising the other forms of overlapping discrimination and disadvantage that women face, and really making sure that the movement reflects those elements as well. And I think you start to see some of that stuff when people just talk about age and pay gap of 18% in the US, without reflecting on the fact that Hispanic women and African American women pay gap is double, more than double. I think we often see it in conversations around progressive women leadership in other areas, and it often focuses on corporate roles and representation on massive company boards, but actually for millions of women, gender equality needs to be focusing on safe, secure employment, a living wage and a social safety net. And as part of that reflection, I'm also reflective about voting systems, and when we're thinking about enfranchisement and representation and accountability, particularly at an event like this, which sort of forces us to contrast Australia and America, so really reflect on our compulsory voting system here in Australia. It's pretty rare around the world. It's definitely in its minority, but I think it helps us hold others accountable to the whole population and not just those who vote. And I think it helps make the decisions that our political leaders take more legitimate when all of our eligible voters are participating. Culturally, I suspect there's no way that compulsory voting would ever become a thing in the United States with the value placed on freedom. But I think in the lead up to the 2020 election, a really strong focus on supporting and enabling people to vote will be critical in bringing the country. And the last reflection I had was, in relation to this anniversary, I'm still very ambitious about this agenda. When we consider that it's been 100 years since women have been able to vote in the US, 100 years ago, we still thought that in 100 years we'll be waiting for that, final glass ceiling of the first female president of the United States to be shattered. And in Australia, despite having elected our first female prime minister, our work is far from done. And I think one of the challenges is, once you have those firsts that Anne talks about, that burning platform for change almost goes away. People think, we've had our first prime minister, we've had our first female minister of defence, we've had our first female foreign minister, job's done. And actually, I think we really need to maintain the rage and the focus. And one of the interesting legacies of Julia Gillard's time, I think, conversely, rather than encouraging everyone to, and particularly young women, to dream big and think that they can get into the fray of political life, I actually think that there was a real lasting legacy of damage, particularly around the way that she was treated by the Australian public, by the media and the Parliament, which I think was absolutely disgusting. And I think that so many more people should come to her defence and, look at influential male CEOs in the community who talk about gender equality in their organisations but didn't call out that behaviour in our political arena. So I think as a society, when we're looking at barriers to female political participation, really focusing on dismantling some of those barriers for women getting into politics, but also what their experience is when they are in the political arena as well. So that action is a real burning part of this reflection for me too.
Jessica?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting us to speak here tonight. I know for all of us it's something we don't take lightly. And I think it would be really easy to think, oh wow, fantastic, women have the vote, in the States, it's amazing. But there's so much change that so many individuals still want to see, not only in America, but across the globe for women. And for me, the women's suffrage movement was not a movement led only by two amazing women in the form of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady. It was a movement led by thousands of women from different races, different ethnicities, and different socioeconomic backgrounds. So I just really need to make sure we acknowledge that tonight. And the thing that brought them all together was this vote. And they all chanted, all marched for an America that recognised their contribution, their voice, and ultimately their vote. And tonight I thought it would be really nice just to shine a light on two women who really have impacted me in my own journey, who were suffragists, One of them was Nanny Helen Burrows, and I hope that's a name that you remember today and always. Nanny was an African American educator. She was an orator, a civil rights activist, feminist, a businesswoman, and Nanny was instrumental in the National Baptist Convention in making sure they came on board and took the suffrage moment and took made people get active in that, and also other social reform. But Burrows saw the vote for Black women as essential for their freedom of both racial and sex discrimination. So I think it's really important to highlight women like Nanny in this, because there's so many people that get left out of the history, and something that and reflection on as well as there. And Nanny dedicated her whole life to fighting for equality between the races, and saw the role of African American women as more than domestic servants, and further the opportunities available to African American women by opening up a training school for them. And I think that's really important, because still African American women in the United States are still further behind in terms of education, in terms of pay gap. So these are things that we still want to shine a light on today. And the second person was Mabel Lee, and Mabel was amazing. She was a Chinese advocate for women's suffrage in America, but actually could never vote. She could never vote because of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. Yeah. And the New York Times in 1912 said this of Mabel. She was regarded as a symbol of the new era when all women will be free and unhampered. And I just love that, because she represents so much back then, but even for us now, because women are still yearning for that change and desiring for that change. And Mabel's teen activism invigorated many to join the cause. Beyond the suffrage movement, she dedicated her life to serving others in need in her local Chinese community city. And I think that's something so important for the suffragists. They weren't just fighting for the right to vote, they were fighting for their entire communities and really laid down their lives for that. And yet 100 years on, that struggle continues today. And there are still so many obstacles faced by women across the globe, like we've mentioned before. And I just feel like we do stand on the shoulders of giants. They paved a way for us, but we still have so much farther to go as well. And the women's suffrage movement has shown me that it's never just one person who can create change. It takes all hands on deck approach to create that change. And I'm proud to apply this approach to everything I'm working towards in order to create lasting and measurable change for all as well. So that's something I've really taken away from that movement.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Before we get to questions from the audience, I have a question myself that I'd like to bring up. And the first question I have is that I have two wonderful, strong daughters, a tween and a teen, age 11 and 15. And with the idea of maintaining the rage, and now hopefully looking at standing on your shoulders from all the great work that you do, what would your advice be for young secondary school women in Australia or elsewhere on paths as they start to forge their career?
Nice. Sure. Okay. Well, first of all, I never had daughters. I'm totally jealous. But I do have a female dog, and I'm waiting for grandchildren. But my sons won't give me any access. I would say to them, if I had listened to everybody who told me it can't be done, or you can't do that, or that's just the way it is, and I still get told quite a bit, I would not be where I am today. So do not accept that. Do not accept when people tell you it can't be done, you won't get there, that's just the way it is. And find somebody who is going to see in you the potential that you can't see in yourself. I have been incredibly fortunate in my life, both in my professional and my personal life, that I've had people around me who tell me, you should do this. You'd be good at that. And I'd be like, oh, really? You think so? I don't know. I'm not quite sure. And it's kind of part of, for me, it was part of growing up, being kind of self-deprecating and second-guessing and questioning yourself and that whole imposter syndrome. So find somebody is going to see in you the potential that you may not see in yourself. Listen to them and don't listen to the people who tell you.
Yeah, so I think when I reflect on, when I was a teenager and who I sort of thought were going to be successful and change the world, as I get older and my vintage start really making their mark, it's interesting because it's not necessarily the ones you think when you're a little kid that are going to go out and do it. And making me reflect on, it's not necessarily the people who are, straight A students and very kind of professional and smart. It's people who dare to dream and to see things differently and to be bold and to be innovative. And I think critically it's people who back themselves. And it's really interesting when you look at research of confidence in women, when young children are, out in the world, young boys and young girls have the same level of confidence, and something that happens in teens and doesn't sort of, equalise until you're in your 80s or 90s, by which time you probably miss some critical opportunities. And so there's something in our societies that really extinguishes the confidence in women. And I think it's completely destructive and part of the reason why we don't see more women in so many areas of life taking up leadership positions. So I think Anne's point on resilience and confidence and backing yourself is absolutely critical. And I think that piece around having people who support you and to do what you can do. Jess and I were talking before the panel about how important it is to tap people on the shoulder to get them to put themselves forward. And despite working in this space and knowing all of the research, I still find myself very guilty of the same thing. And there's something very powerful, that cliche of if you can't see it, you can't bear it, is so true. And I remember, in my law school, I was on the Law Society, and I never thought that I could be president because I was this kind of low-key guy who drank a lot. So I was like, well, that's not going to be my role. And then someone tapped me on the shoulder and said, why don't you think about it? And I thought, you giving me your permission? Random guy who I shouldn't have entrusted my future pathway to. And simply, and I sort of thought to myself, I'm going to learn this lesson. And then again, when I was on the UN Women Board, I never dared to think that I could be the chair of it, the natural president of the organisation, because the chair had always been this illustrious woman who spent her whole career doing A, B, and C, who was full-time available to do the job in Western Australia. So, I think those self-limiting beliefs that we put on ourselves are far more restrictive than we even realise. So I guess in addition to the advice I give young women, I'd also give advice to people around young women. Do everything you can to encourage and support and facilitate, because until we address those confidence gaps, that hold those confidence is critical.
I would say I've had the opportunity to meet a lot of young women through my own work, working at the union, and also organising rallies and campaigns, activism, all the rest of it. And I'm actually quite taken back by the 20s and teens that I meet, because they are so bold. And they're so much more bullshit than who I was and some of the women that even I know. And that's amazing, because I think that some of that confidence they've got, knowing who they are, has come from so many people before them. So I would just say continue on being bold and bullshit, and continue to ask for what you want and be real about it and not backing down. And one of the other things I would just say is that, in terms of activism and paving that way forward, if they do get knocked back, or if they've got that moment of self-doubt, or they're lacking that self-confidence, make sure they've got some really great friends around them that are going to back them all the way. And something that, Beth and I were talking about beforehand is having those women around you that tap you on the shoulder. Say, hey, have you thought about this? Have you considered this? Seeking other people's perspective is so important, but you don't want everyone's perspective. But finding the right people is key, to continue on that journey.
It was sort of a time when there were so many of our role models and our leaders are men, and we're now realising that I think we take on some of their characteristics as what a leader looks like. And it means that when women are assuming roles and characteristics, we're sort of internally thinking to be a leader, you need to be, for example, arrogant or, decisive or this or that, when actually, you can be someone who can be an incredible leader because you're empathetic, you're conciliatory, you're a great diplomat, you bring people together. And so I think, what advice we can give people to bring themselves and their own unique personality traits to their roles would be so valuable, because our role needs diverse styles of leadership.
Questions? Do you want to read them all, Bailey? Because they're on a small screen. Actually, sure, left up and help. So, let's see. All right, thank you. There we are. All right, the first question. Voter turnout in the US is approximately half that in Australia. Do we know what percentage of those who want to vote are able to do so? And how do those numbers compare to men and women? Actually, a good question that I'm not really sure that I have
It's a great question. Yeah, I've got some thoughts on it. So I think after voter turnout, I was really surprised when I spent time in America that voting was it was the first Tuesday.
It's always the first Tuesday after a Monday.
Yeah. That strikes me as an odd and inconvenient day for lots of people.
It is.
Which I think is probably, is hard. And I think there's a lot of things about voting turnout that are very, predicated on that fact around who are the types of people who are in employment that has absolutely no flexibility in how to turn out between certain hours or levels of paycheck. People's access to transport to get to voting places, all of those kind of barriers are really, and I think from the country we've seen some of the barriers like they're being further exacerbated. They have an impact on particular minorities. That means that the electoral system and participation is not as broad as I think it would have expected it to be 100 years ago at this point in time, with all of the aspirations we had. So I think those things are deeply troubling. And that kind of minority piece is really problematic. Interestingly, I'm not sure about the men and women divide on voting participation.
I don't know, just if you have any knowledge on that. I don't know what the divide. I do know, at least, I'm not sure if it's 100% true. Date that is set, that Tuesday in November goes back to the law from 1842. When it was a little difficult to get into town to actually register and vote, so usually they wanted to make sure that at the time to get into the city, village, to actually post
Farmers and markets and something like that.
We're going to vote. I do know that quite a few states have gone to early voting as well, and opening polls earlier on. Certainly doesn't mean that we have numbers that are equivalent with other industrial societies. And also voting, like 6 number, you get 60+% turnout.
I think that a really interesting part of that question is people who want to vote.
Yes.
And I think that for me raises questions about trust in our political institutions and the value of the vote and how people value their vote, how people value their political participation, and how people value their vote as a form of political participation. I think we live in a world where there are so many other forms of participation, political participation, including activism, where people can just click like or retweet or put something up on their social media, and to them it feels like they've made a political statement, participated in a political activism in some way. And yes, they are, but does that then undermine the value of the vote? Apart from the fact that we have really low levels of trust in political institutions. So I think the critical part of that question for me is people want to vote. Do people want to vote? Inevitably, every time there's a federal election or a state election in Australia, you have people who don't vote, who put in informal votes, who compromise, who resist the compulsory voting. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done around that, around revaluing the vote and revaluing political participation, but also recognising different forms of political participation.
It's part of a social contract, and I worry that this, everything crazy that's going on in the world, there seems to be less discussion of our responsibilities as citizens and more focus on our entitlements. And I actually think, we want our democracy to be improved, we want our political systems to be better, we have to participate in it. And the only way things are going to improve is if people buy in and engage and, are across the issues and across the kind of various platforms. And so, I'm obviously very biased. I do love our compulsory voting system, but I think that kind of emphasis on responsibility is part of our civic kind of, our responsibility to the community is really critical.
Yeah, I would just like reflecting on what both and Beth were saying before. And one of the things was also, valuing the vote, I think we spoke to that, but also political leaders and buying back into that, and if we're going to, I'm just thinking about people in the States who've only got that one day, maybe we've got early voting, seeing, stories where people are, trying to bang in to get their vote and having to take, lining up in these big, massive queues. There's all these things that would just dishearten you if you were in that position. But I really think it comes back to, educating people why it's important and not berating them if they don't think it's important, but at least starting those conversations with people, and also making sure we've got political leaders that people really follow and value and connecting with the actual voters as well, Yeah.
I mean, one other just brief side note, as an American, as someone who is voting absentee, as I have for the past couple of years, it is complicated. There's a lot of responsibility to it. When I will be voting in November and about 2 months away, my ballot will probably be about 4 or 5 pages long.
Wow.
So it's not just the federal elections for president, for Senate, for the House of Representatives. I have quite a few local elections, and the state where I'm registered also has ballot issues, where we'll have referendums on the ballot asking about specific potential changes to the state constitution. So it gets complicated.
Yeah, and there's a lot there as well, and that educational piece is so important. Yeah.
Okay, next question. What are your thoughts on quotas in political representation members, i.e. specifying a number of seats that must be held by women, minority groups, indigenous people, etc.? Do you think it is necessary and would be a good idea, or would it more incite more issues in political representation than international?
Can I start?
Please.
Because this is my thing. Ashley, let me tell you this. Often we see quotas as the be-all and end-all, and they are not. They are not the be-all and end-all. So I'm going to give you an example. Right now, in the federal parliament, the 5 most marginal seats in the Labor Party, in the opposition, are all held by women on a margin of very, very slim margins of less than 1%. That includes me. Okay. So if at the next election there is a slight swing away from Labor, we are likely to lose 5 women. So while we have, and we can pat ourselves on the back that we're almost at 50-50, where do those women sit? They sit in the most marginal seats. When you hold a marginal seat, the truth is there is little time for you to perform other parliamentary duties that can help you build a political career, help you build a career as a parliamentarian, and visualise yourself in a kind of a senior level, because you are so busy trying to increase that margin that all your activities are undertaken in trying to increase that margin. That is the truth. So while it's all very well to have quotas, the substantive equality is where I want to see the focus. There are so many industries out there that can boast about having 50% women, but where are they located within the industry? They are located at the bottom rungs. They are stuck in the bottom rungs. The universities are a good point for that. Like, how many of professors, do they have 50-50 representation of professors, even though they may have a slight majority of the workforce being women? They're not represented in the higher levels of decision making. So on the question of quotas, I was really surprised when I visited the Egyptian Parliament. Now, the Egyptian Parliament is dysfunctional. There's about 169 members, something like that. But they have quotas. They have quotas for people with disability. They have 11 people with disability in their parliament, 9 of them are women. They have quotas for Nubians, who are the, I guess, indigenous Egyptians. They have quotas for representation of Nubians. They have quotas for representation of Coptic minorities. So there is something to be said for quotas, because there is more than just a symbolic side to representation. But they are not the end game. The end game should be a substantive form of equality that isn't just having us there at the table, but allowing us to also partake in the leadership, to partake in eating. It's no good inviting me to the table if you're not going to let me.
Yeah.
I don't disagree with anything you've said, but I reckon you are looking over a hill that I don't think we have climbed yet. So I am a huge advocate of quotas because I think that the Labor Party is in the position that it is because it enacted those quotas and got those women there in the room. I completely accept all your points. And I think, women in marginal states is one of the worst manifestations and some of the kind of implementation of that quota. But I think the quota is critical. Let's focus on getting that piece right. And without a quota, you can have targets and aspirations. But I think the progress, particularly when you look at Parliament without Labor in there, which is primarily the National Party, their representation numbers have been terrible. And they always talk about the things that they're doing to make it more palatable for women to get into politics, but the numbers are not changing at any rate that they need to change. And such a glacial pace, and I think it really goes to their relevance and their ability to represent their electorate. So I see quotas as incredibly important to drive the cultural change necessary to get into the habit of and the kind of pattern of and the culture of women as leaders in politics. And once they are there, the next step is how do we make sure they are in substantive positions of leadership, that they're not overrepresented in marginal seats, that there are no other forms of bias, that actually they're full and participation in the leadership and other opportunities.
So I don't disagree with you about quotas, but maybe we should be having quotas for women in safe seats rather than just quotas for women.
Yep.
Quotas for women in positions of decision-making positions rather than quotas for women in our organisation. So we need to ramp up the idea of quotas so that it does achieve substantive change, as opposed to it just being a tick box.
I think the only thing I'd like to add is if we could take the Egyptian concept of quotas and add that to the Labor Party, that would be amazing. That dysfunction, that would be incredible. But yeah, that's where I stand with quotas. Like, they are really important. They're not the only way to make that change, but I'm doing to see more women on both sides of politics on which safe seats.
And also we need, if we're going to look at quotas, then we should look at intersectionality quotas as well. So it's not just enough to focus on gender in a quota. We need to look at gender, disability, race, ethnicity. So, why don't we have a quota for women with Indigenous women with disabilities in safe seats?
It's amazing how corporate boards, for a long time have, had their skills matrices and their assessment of all of the kind of things you need to get a well-functioning governance team. But political parties still have amazing over-representations in the kind of, class, race, professional backgrounds that really does not lead to best practice in governance decision.
And so with that, how would that work in Australia? Top-down decision of a law that require?
Well, you could, but you have the starting point for anything is political will. So you need to have political will, and to have political will, you need to have a recognition of the value of it. And to have the recognition of the value, you need to have awareness. And to have awareness, you have to have critical mass. So it's kind of like a chicken and egg situation. But once you have a critical mass, the reason why we've been able to change things for women is because there was critical mass of women who pushed for changes within the parliament. It is a chicken and egg situation. You need the critical mass to push it through, to raise the awareness, to get the political will to keep making the change. And I guess this goes back to the opening statements where we all say, here we are standing on the shoulders of giants and walking in her footsteps, that we leave those footsteps as well, that this is the change, these are the changes that we can make.
I think we have time for maybe one more question or so. Can you tell us about some casual, non-casual, day-to-day discrimination that you encounter from Mark?
I do.
I remember in my last job, I always thought, and this is a lesson that I've learned and not made the same mistake again. I had made two assumptions. One is if I worked hard, my work would be acknowledged and recognised, and it would speak for itself rather than it's crazy. So it's okay. And the other one was I thought I worked for an NGO and I thought, we're in an insecure funding growth environment, so I won't, try and push for, to get a pay rise because I was woefully underpaid, even relative to our funding environment. I realised then that you never get anything unless you ask for it. NGOs always have insecure funding environments, so I don't think there's ever an NGO without an insecure funding environment. And the bit at the end was when I was stepping down from the role of moving on and they were recruiting someone else, they had a guy in mind for the role. The board literally said in front of me, we will need to pay, we're going to need to raise the salary by about $25,000 to make it palatable for someone else to take this job. And right in front of me, I just couldn't believe it. And I don't know, I had this simmering rage for months and months. And now I think it actually has been beneficial because it meant that I've certainly been better at negotiating role, position, salary, recognition for work ever since then. And I think everyone kind of needs those experiences in their life where they kind of feel this burning sense of injustice that galvanizes them better at that.
I think for me, maybe it's more so in advocacy capacities, but it comes back to wages and meeting so many people who work in the same job for 5 years but being discriminated against and about trying to find their voice. So I think, and we think these things, we kind of normalise it as well. It's like, oh yeah, that's right, just find another job, and leave it and not do anything about it. But for me, the biggest thing that I keep saying to people is like, you need to stand up for yourself. You need to say something. And we're going to try everything to fix it in terms of that discrimination that we face.
I think for me it's really difficult to separate the discrimination that's based on gender from kind of the intersectionalities of being a minority woman and colour. And so for me that kind of discrimination is layered in so many different ways. But I do want to tell a little story that I think kind of, I know that whenever I tell this story, I see women around the room like they recognise it. I remember I was the only woman on a all-male board, and we were deciding on a resolution of what we were going to do. So they kind of went around the room about what we should do, and they started with me, and I said, look, I think on this matter we should do A, B, C. Male number one goes, I agree with Anne, we should do A, B, C. Male number two goes, I agree with male number one, we should do A, B, C. Male number three goes, I agree with males number 1 and 2. Male number 4 goes, yeah, males 1, 2, and 3, I agree with them. By the time we got around the room, they were all congratulating themselves for coming up with my idea. It's so true. But, and I think I kind of like said to myself, I remember walking out there and going, it just happened. But at least I got what I wanted. Yeah. At least I got what I wanted out of it and got them to adopt the resolution that I wanted. And I think that's kind of the reality of the world that we operate in, that women live and operate in, particularly when we are at those levels, whether it's on a board or in politics or in any kind of decision-making capacity, where we kind of, and that to me encapsulates the discrimination that we live with. Is that we have to find different ways of making things happen. We cannot take for granted because we don't have that kind of that privilege or that entitlement to be able to take for granted that we're going to say something and it's going to be attributed to us. It does get attributed to me. It's not a good thing, but that we're going to have. If it's that it's going to be attributed to us. Recognised for all those things. So I think that kind of, to me, I always hold that as a really good kind of example of what it means to be discriminated against and to live with that.
And it's all the sort of solutions or the answers to these things are always put back on women or the people who are discriminated against, which is to stand up for yourself more and to assert this and do this. And it drives me crazy because when I work with organisations in my capacity as a consultant, I always say to them, stop trying to change women. So if we know that women don't feel themselves for promotion. Don't just sort of acknowledge that fact and sort of think, oh, well, we'll encourage them, we build their confidence and wait till they're ready. No, go and tap them on the shoulder and go and make sure you're having those interventionist conversations. We know women don't negotiate their salary more. Well, I think it's a bit unrealistic to expect organisations to, do too much on that. But I think we've got to make sure that we're not trying to, that cliche of not trying to fix the women, fix the system. So these systems and cultures have been designed for and adapted for male leaders. How do we make sure they better respond to, a diversity of people in those roles?
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. I want to thank everyone for joining us, for tuning in. But most especially, I'd like to thank our esteemed, outstanding panelists, Anne, Beth, and Jessica, for joining us tonight to not just commemorate 100 years of women's voting rights in the United States, but as we said, to really look forward to a continuous fight. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us. We look forward to seeing everybody else joining us for our next conversation.
Thank you. And I, on behalf of all of us, thank you, David, and thank everyone who was watching, and thank everyone who's here in the room today.
Yes.
Thank you.
Bye.